Oh, you are so handsome. Hey, I'm talking to you.
Listen, if I want to talk to you, I'll talk to you. From now on, you just keep your mouth shut.
Hey, what's up? We have some protests happening in Mississippi and those infamous links to psychosis we're going to dive into. So in November of 2020, the big election that was potentially one of the most chaotic of American history, Mississippi was voting also in favor of medical marijuana, and by a huge margin. 74% of the citizens of Mississippi voted in favor of having a medical marijuana market in the state. However, quickly after that, the state Supreme Court kind of just struck down the whole thing and overruled the votes and said that's not going to happen. Now, after a lot of blowback from that, they have, or the governor and the state senate have both kind of said that they're going to create their own medical marijuana market that would be similar to to the mandate that was voted on. However, it's just nothing has happened really. They've said they have to figure out funding, but we haven't heard anything, and it's almost been a year now. So, protests have been happening in Mississippi, which is actually really interesting because we don't really see many protests happening when it comes to marijuana. But in Mississippi, a rather red state, we're seeing protests pop up. And there was a big rally that happened in May. And just recently, over this weekend, there was another protest that popped up, and it seems the protesters themselves are pretty bipartisan. They're coming from different places. One of the people, there was a news organization, a local news organization that put out a video, and they interviewed a guy with a MAGA hat on. And so anyway, here's a clip from that video.
This past November, 74% of Mississippi voters thought they were making their voices heard when they voted in favor of a medical marijuana initiative. The Supreme Court thought otherwise and overruled the votes.
We voted, and it's supposed to be a democracy, and it seems like everybody is colluding against democracy.
Governor Tate Reeves has said he is working with lawmakers on details about how the state will pay for the proposed medical marijuana program. The House and the Senate want to enact a medical marijuana program to replace the initiative voters passed that was struck down by the state Supreme Court. At this point, many believe the state is only looking out for itself.
We are the 74%. That's kind of what their rallying cry is, which is kind of nice. We are the 74%. This seems like it can go a long way, because again, medical marijuana is a rather bipartisan issue. Most people agree that it's something that should be popping up in every state. And so for lawmakers to see this, it's just an easy thing for them to get behind, and it's weird that they haven't. So hopefully this does make a change in some way for Mississippi, and we'll start to see some actual process or progress happen soon. Next story. So I have been back and forth with this whole idea, this whole link between heavy use of cannabis and psychosis and onset of psychosis. There have been a bunch of studies, or a few studies that come out of different sizes showing this correlation. One in particular showed, which was pretty damning, showed that 50% of the psychosis cases in Amsterdam were due to heavy use of cannabis. That's an extremely large number and really scary when you think of it. Then, just today, I found a study that kind of refutes a lot of the points on that one. So I found this interesting, and it's going to be a little dry because I'm just going to read passages from it, but it's important for us to do because it also goes into why these studies are a little bit flawed from the onset. And I think that's important for all of us to know and to have a reason, and maybe we can see where this correlation is even coming from, and that it's definitely not a causation. So this study is called High Potency Cannabis and Incident Psychosis, Correcting the Causal Assumption. So they take that Amsterdam study in particular, and they look at the methods they use to get to their point, and found some flaws in the practice. In their recent paper, Marta Di Forti and colleagues conclude that removing one environmental factor, daily high-potency cannabis use, would reduce the incidence of all psychotic disorders in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, by 50%, from 37.9 to 18.8 cases per 100,000 person years. We think that this is very unlikely given that Sullivan and colleagues confirmed the heritability of schizophrenia to be about 80%. So right there, they're kind of pointing out that this is actually, it's mathematically impossible for these numbers to come out. Indeed, high-potency cannabis use can lead to drug-induced psychosis, and high-potency cannabis use might trigger earlier onset of psychosis in genetically vulnerable individuals who would have developed psychosis anyway. But these conclusions are all very different from stating that high-potency cannabis use is responsible for 50% of incident psychosis cases in Amsterdam. And that's one of the main points, is that they looked at the data and said that because of cannabis use, these people are becoming psychosis, but there's a difference between people who are prone to become psychosis and catch an earlier onset of the disease, as opposed to somebody who maybe wasn't going to become psychotic and then cannabis use pushed them in that direction. Those are two extremely different things. So how can DeForti and colleagues conclude that 50.3% of incident psychosis cases in Amsterdam are attributable to high-potency cannabis? The answer is simple. They calculated PAFs from the observed odds ratios, assuming causality, i.e. that the observed OR is 100% causal. However, case control studies such as theirs generally suffer from considerable confounding. Moore and colleagues, in reviewing studies about the association between cannabis use and psychosis, showed that 10 to 85% of the observed risk was due to confounding. So that's actually, there's a lot in that little passage there. But first, confounding, I read this and was like, I've never seen confounding in this kind of circumstance. So what confounding really means in this context is it's referred to as a mixing of effects, wherein the effects of the exposure under study on a given outcome are mixed in with the effects of an additional factor or set of factors, resulting in a distortion of the true relationship. And what they are stating in this paper is that 10 to 85% of observed risk in most of these papers that relate psychosis to cannabis is a result of confounding or a distortion. That's a huge number, 10 to 85%. I mean, it's extremely large range, but if something is 85% due to confounding, then you can't really trust anything in that paper at all. And finally, thus, taking actions to prevent incident psychosis is certainly a good idea, but prohibition of high-potency cannabis is unlikely to substantially reduce new cases of psychosis. This feels to me like a place where I feel comfortable leaving my opinion at. The idea that, yes, cannabis can push people who are prone to psychosis towards that at a sooner date, but it does not create psychosis out of thin air. By far, the biggest factor in psychosis is your genes. 80% is your genes. I found this very fascinating. I think it's worth knowing about, especially when more studies come out and more fear comes out because of it. Cool, yeah, and that was a lot, but that's it for today. We'll be back on Wednesday with more stuff. See you then.